The fox appeared at the edge of the ice at 7:43 in the morning, and Eliot Vance, age 9, almost didn't see it. He would have walked right past it. He would have stepped onto the lake the same way he had stepped onto it every winter morning for 3 years. He would have made it to school in 12 minutes. Right at the spot where Eliot always took his first step onto the lake, it wasn't running. It wasn't crouched or feeding or doing anything that a fox at the edge of a frozen lake in January could be reasonably expected to do. It was just standing there, facing him very still, its amber eyes locked on his face with an attention that felt wrong in a way Eliot could not name. Not aggressive, not afraid, just present and deliberate and completely unmovable. Eliot stopped. He looked at the fox. The fox looked at him. Behind it, the lake stretched out flat and pale for 400 meters, all the way to the far bank and the path that cut up through the birch trees to the school road. That was the route. It had always been the route. His father, Cormac Vance, had shown him 3 years ago when the family first moved to Harlan County, pressing the heel of his boot against the ice to test it, nodding, telling Eliot this was fine, this was good. The ice out here got thick enough in January to drive a small car across if you needed to. His father had shown him where to step and where not to step, how to read the color of the ice, dark gray being bad, light gray being better, white being best, how to listen for cracking, how to spread your weight if you felt something shift beneath you. Eliot had done it so many times the route had stopped being something he thought about. Eliot took a slow step toward it. The fox didn't retreat. It shifted its weight the way a territorial animal shifts its weight when it has decided to hold its ground. And it kept its amber eyes on him with that strange fixed quality, not blinking, not flickering toward the tree line, the way a wild animal normally would when it sensed a human approaching. Its ears stayed upright and forward. It breathed steadily. It was not afraid of him. Eliot had never been this close to a fox. He had seen them before, from windows, from the back seat of the car, on the drive to school, once from his bedroom window at dusk, like it's always going somewhere, and always knows exactly where that is. They were animals that treated the presence of humans as a category of event that required distance and speed, keeping itself between him and the lake with a smoothness that made it look almost choreographed, as if it had anticipated the direction he would try. He could see its breath in the cold air, small quick puffs from its pointed nose. Its coat was deep rust against the white snow, its tail low and dense, touching the snow but not dragging. It was a large fox, he thought, larger than he expected. Its paws were planted at the very boundary where packed snow turned to ice, and it had not stepped onto the lake itself. Not once. Eliot was going to be late for school. She was on a conference call from 8 until at least 9, and he should not interrupt her unless there was an emergency. He thought about walking the long way around, but that was 40 minutes on a good day, and the temperature was dropping, and he was already edging toward late. He tried once more to step around the fox, angling far to the left this time, nearly pushing into the reeds frozen at the bank's edge. He stood there in the cold for a long moment, his bag heavy on his shoulders, his fingers going numb inside his gloves, and looked at the fox, and the fox looked back at him, and neither of them moved. What Eliot did not know, standing at the edge of the lake that January morning, was that 2 years earlier, a man named Aldrich Svein, who had owned property on the northern bank for 30 years and had fished the lake every season since his 20s, had reported a geological fracture in the lake bed near the southern feeding creek. Aldrich had reported it to the county land office with a hand-drawn map and a note that said this is a hazard and someone is going to go through it someday. The county had noted it. The county had filed it. Nobody had come to mark the ice. What Eliot did not know was that the section of ice he crossed every morning was not the section Aldrich had flagged. The section Eliot crossed was 40 meters west of the fracture zone, safe and thick, and exactly what his father had told him it was. Aldrich's section was further east, near the old fishing platform that jutted out over the water on rusted iron supports about 30 meters from the eastern bank. The platform had been closed for 2 seasons, the wooden decking rotten and the supports compromised, and McConty had posted a small weathered sign that said no access, which had been half buried by snow since November. His father had checked the route. His father had been careful. But this winter had been different from other winters. The temperature had cycled in October in a way it hadn't in years. That cycling had done something to the fracture. It had allowed water to work at the edges in ways it hadn't before. By January, the fracture zone was wider than Aldrich had mapped it. It had spread, quietly, invisibly, in the direction of the eastern bank. And the ice above it, which had looked exactly like every other section of ice on the lake, was now a surface that was less than 2 inches thick in places where it should have been 8. Eliot turned around and walked the long way to school. He arrived 40 minutes late, Mrs. And he sat down and opened his book, and the day moved forward the way days do. Indifferent to what had happened at the edge of the lake that morning, he didn't tell anyone about the fox. He wasn't entirely sure what he would say. He sat with it for the rest of the school day, and on the walk home, and at dinner, turning it over. He didn't think about this too carefully. He just did it. Not the fox as a danger or a problem to be solved. The fox as a presence. The way it had stood there. The way it had moved with him when he tried to get past. He had a book about animals on his shelf. A large illustrated reference guide his grandmother had given him 2 Christmases ago, and he pulled it out and flipped to the fox section. The book said foxes were highly territorial and could hold home ranges of up to 50 square kilometers. It said they had excellent memory for their territory and could remember the locations of buried food caches across an entire season. He closed the book and looked at the ceiling for a while. Then he set his alarm 20 minutes earlier than usual. The next morning, the fox was there again. It came from the direction of the eastern birch thicket at almost exactly the same time, and it took up the same position, and it watched him with the same attention. Eliot stood at the bank for several minutes looking at it. Then he walked the long way. He was late again. Mrs. Pierce wrote a note this time. He was arriving at the lake early. Not late, not just on time, but early, bag on his back. Leaving the house while his mother was still drinking her first coffee, walking the trail through the trees in the gray early light so that he could be at the bank before the fox arrived. She believed him because it was partially true. He did like it. He liked the way the woods sounded before the day had fully organized itself into something predictable. He sat on the bank in the snow and waited. The fox came from the birch trees at 7:38, 5 minutes before he used to arrive at the crossing. He looked back. After a while, it looked away, out at the lake, and he looked out at the lake too, and they sat together in the cold morning quiet, with their breath making small clouds and the ice making none. He started to notice things he hadn't before. The way the lake sounded different in different temperatures, as if the ice were conducting something from the water beneath it. The way the light hit the surface at certain angles and revealed variations in texture that you couldn't see head-on. Some sections glassy and some sections duller, some that caught the color of the sky and some that seemed to absorb it. He noticed that the fox never turned its gaze toward the western section, the one Eliot had always crossed. It always looked east, toward the birch trees on the far bank, toward whatever was over there that the fox had been watching before Eliot started arriving early to watch it back. He didn't know what to do with this observation. He didn't know what he was supposed to do with any of it. He was 9 years old, and he was missing the first 10 minutes of class every day because he was sitting on a frozen bank with a wild fox. And he had no way to explain this that would make sense to a teacher or his parents or anyone. So he kept it to himself and he kept arriving early, and he kept watching. On the fifth morning, something happened that changed everything. He had been at the bank for about 20 minutes, watching the fox, watching the lake, watching the birch trees on the eastern side, because that was where the fox had come from, and he had started to feel, without quite articulating it, that the fox was connected to something over there. A thin sound came through the cold air, just barely reaching him, high and sustained, like something working at the edge of hearing. Eliot frowned and turned toward it. And then it turned and looked directly at Eliot in a way that had never quite happened before. He could. He moved along the bank toward the eastern side, keeping his feet in the snow and off the ice, and the fox walked with him at a loose distance, pausing when he paused, moving when he moved. As he got closer to the old fishing platform, he could make out more of the sound, the source of it. And when he reached the edge of the bank and looked down through the iron supports, a gray and white dog, medium-sized, with the kind of dense double coat that says cold climate breeding in every fiber of it. It was standing on the ice near the platform's edge, and the ice around it was wrong. Not uniformly wrong, not visibly cracked, but wrong in exactly the way his father had described wrong, that particular shade of gray that is too pale, too waterlogged looking, a surface that sits on the water differently than solid ice sits. The dog was standing in the center of this section and making the thin, high sound Eliot had been hearing, and it was not moving. It had gone very still in the instinctive way that animals go still when they have processed a danger they can't physically reason about, but that their body understands completely. It knew, Eliot thought. It knew the ice under it was wrong, and it had stopped, and it was calling, and it was waiting. Carefully and without panic, because his father had told him that panic was the thing that turned a bad situation into a worse one. He understood that going down there himself was wrong. He understood that reaching toward the platform was wrong. He understood that calling for help was right. He called his mother. The call went to voicemail. Conference call still running. He called his father. His father answered on the second ring. Eliot told him in a low, clear voice what he was seeing, where he was, the dog on the ice, the wrong color of the surface, the platform. His father said, "Stay there. Do not step on the ice. I'm coming. Keep watching." And then the phone screen went black, because Eliot had meant to charge it the night before and had gotten distracted by a book about deep-sea creatures. And the battery, which had been at 11% when he left the house, had found its moment. He looked in both directions along the bank. He was looking for a neighbor, a hiker. The nearest house was his own, 400 meters back through the woods. The road was further than that. He looked at the fox. The fox had followed him to the edge of the bank above the platform. It was sitting in the snow at the top of the embankment, watching the dog below, and then it looked at Eliot, and then it got up and moved east, further along the bank, picking its way carefully, and looked back at him. He followed it. He would say later that he was not sure what he thought he was doing. He would say that he wasn't following the fox in the sense of believing it was leading him to something. He would say that he just needed to do something, and following was the only available option. But he would also say, when he was being fully honest, that there was something in the way the fox moved that morning, something specific and directed, something that was not random wandering, and that even at 9 years old he could feel the difference between an animal moving without purpose and an animal moving toward one. The far end of the fishing platform was about 15 meters along the bank from where he had been standing. The structure there had collapsed some years ago, one of the iron supports giving way. Coiled around the upright post of the nearest intact support was a length of orange rope. Thick synthetic rope, weather-faded but solid, the kind that gets used for dock lines or work applications and left coiled on a post because whoever left it there. It was long, at least 12 meters, and heavy in his hands. The dog looked at the rope. It made the thin sound again. Eliot held the rope steady, and he talked to the dog because he didn't know what else to do, and silence felt wrong. And he talked about the only dog he knew, which was his family's dog, a black lab named Soot, who was 11 years old and moved slowly now, but who had a specific relationship with the warmest spot in the kitchen, a corner near the oven where the floor tiles held heat longer than anywhere else in the house. He talked about how Soot would find that spot every morning and lower himself into it with the gravity of an old dog who has learned exactly what he deserves, and how the morning light came through the kitchen window and made a rectangle of warmth on the floor, and Soot would shift himself inch by inch until he was exactly inside it. He thought about the weak ice and what it would sound like if it went. He thought about Soot in the kitchen light. The dog took a step toward the rope. Careful, deliberate, weight distributed. It didn't fall through. It crossed to the rope in 8 slow steps, and Eliot felt it take the rope in its mouth, or perhaps just nose at it, and he pulled carefully. Not quickly, hand over hand, drawing the rope toward him, and the dog came with it, moving toward the bank, scrambled up the slope and onto solid ground, and pressed itself against Eliot with its full weight and shook. He sat up in the snow and put his arms around the dog and held it while it shook, and he realized he was shaking a little too, which was probably the cold, and probably other things as well. When his father arrived 22 minutes later, having driven the access road twice in the wrong direction, because panic will do that to a careful man, who was not a fanciful man, found difficult to categorize as merely animal curiosity. He stepped out of the truck, and the fox regarded him with a brief assessment, then turned and walked back into the birch trees without hurrying, and did not look back. The dog had a collar. The collar had a tag with a phone number and a name. The name was Mott, which Eliot looked up that evening. Originally for windbreak purposes, for shelter, for the protection of what grew near it. The number on the tag belonged to Ren Solberg, 63 years old, who had owned the eastern property for 14 years. Stillness you see in people who have spent many years in the same place and have stopped fighting it. Eliot's mother, Petra Vance, arrived home from her conference call to find a stranger in her kitchen, drinking tea, and her son sitting across the table from her with the expression of someone who has been through a morning that has not yet finished processing itself. She sat down without removing her coat and listened while Ren Solberg explained what had happened, and what the ice near the platform had been doing all winter, and what her dog had been through in 3 days of cold. At some point in the middle of this explanation, she had known about it for 2 seasons and had been watching it spread. She said she had called the county twice, and both times had been told someone would look into it. She said she had planned to put a physical marker on the ice herself, a stake with ribbon, the kind of thing she knew how to do, and that she had put it off because the ice near her bank was obviously thin and she had been keeping. He said his father had taught him about ice, and something passed between them that had to do with what it means to teach a child something carefully. He said, "The fox walked to it and stopped." She said it again, slowly. The fox walked to it and stopped. He said, "Yes." There was a silence in the kitchen, then that had a particular weight. Cormac was preparing to offer an alternative explanation. Eliot could see it in his expression. The rope was just there. The fox was just moving along the bank. A fox follows a path, and a boy follows a fox, and a rope happens to be where you end up when you follow a path along the bank. That's all this is. But Ren held up one hand, gently, and said, "I know that fox." She told them he had been denning in the birch thicket on the eastern bank since she had first moved to the property. She had watched him for years. She knew him by size and gait and the particular set of his tail. Ren looked at him with the patience of someone who has heard this said before. That's knowledge that has accumulated long enough and deep enough that it begins to look, from the outside, like something harder to explain. She paused. She said, "He showed you where the rope was?" Eliot said, "I followed him to it." She said, "That's the same thing." The weak ice near the fishing platform gave way completely at 4:17 that afternoon, 6 hours after Eliot had pulled the dog off it. The section collapsed from below, 8 meters of surface dropping at once into dark water, and the nearest property owner heard a sound he described to the county officer, who came to look at it as a single flat knock, like a door closing in an empty house. The officer who came and measured the collapse site said afterward that the ice in that section had been between 1 and 2 inches thick, well below the threshold for any use. There was a great deal of conversation after that about the marker that should have been placed, and the county report that had not been acted on, and the sign at the platform that had been buried by snow since November. What stayed with people when they heard the story was not the bureaucratic failure, or even the dog. The ice on that route was thick and sound. Cormac confirmed it himself the week after the collapse, walking the full route with a measuring rod in the wind, taking readings at intervals. Eliot had never been in danger on his morning crossing. The fox had not saved him from the hole in the ice. The fox had stopped him from crossing the lake at all, for 5 mornings, until the morning when there was a dog on the ice, and a rope on a post, and a boy who had learned, from somewhere or someone or something, to lie flat in the snow and talk quietly and pull slowly and wait. Wren came back in February with a package. It contained a field guide to birds of the northern interior, a brass compass that had belonged to her husband, and a folded piece of paper on which she had written, in very small and precise handwriting, something an old trapper had told her once when she was young and working land near the northern lakes. She had asked him why the animals seemed to behave differently on his property than they did elsewhere. At the bottom of the page, in her small handwriting, she had written, "Mott still sleeps through thunderstorms, like they aren't happening. You, apparently, cannot sleep through anything that matters." She signed it with her initials, W.S., and nothing else. Eliot kept the note in the same box for the rest of his life. He grew up. This took more time than childhood usually accounted for. There were years of uncertainty and redirect, years of thinking he would study something else, something more practical, something less concerned with the questions that had been living in him since he was 9 years old. He tried environmental law, briefly, and found it addressed the consequences of things he wanted to understand the causes of. He went back to school, and this time he went toward the thing he had always been circling, and he became, of all things, a wildlife ecologist specializing in animal cognition and spatial memory. He did fieldwork on 6 continents. The behaviors that appeared, from the outside, to exceed what the animal was supposed to be capable of. He called it the thing we haven't measured yet. He would say, the animal's behavior budget always exceeds what we can account for. He would say it, and then he would let the silence after it do its work. And in that silence, his students would lean forward slightly, because the silence was where the actual question lived. He thought about the fox often during those lectures. He didn't say so. It was not the kind of source material that sits well in an academic context. When people asked how he had gotten into this work, he told a version of the story. For academic audiences. For children, when he visited schools, he told the version where he sat on the bank every morning with a fox beside him and just looked out at the water. He never told the version about following the fox along the bank to the coiled rope, the fox stopping when Eliot reached it, the fox watching while he lay down in the snow. He kept that version for himself. He found out through a letter forwarded through his university department from a solicitor in Harlan County. She had left him something, the letter said, and he should contact the office to arrange collection. What she left him was the compass, the same brass compass that had come in the February package when he was 9. You spend becoming something. She had kept it. She had written a note with it that said simply, "You left this behind in 2003. The date on the solicitor's envelope was 2003. He had gone to visit her that year, She had made him coffee and asked him direct questions about his research with the focused attention of someone who had spent decades thinking. He had left the compass on her kitchen table by accident when he rushed to make a train. He went back to the lake. Not once, but regularly for years, long after his family had sold the property and moved on, traveling back to Harlan County specifically. He would walk down to the bank in the early morning and stand at the edge of the ice or the water, depending on the season, and stand there for a while before walking back. He sometimes saw a fox in the birch trees on the eastern bank. Sometimes he didn't. He could never tell if it was the same fox or a different one, or what difference that even made. Over enough time, in a territory that an animal had occupied continuously for years. The land held the memory of it even when the individual didn't. The lake was frozen. The birch trees were the same gray-white they always were in winter, standing in their particular arrangement on the eastern bank like something that had been placed there deliberately. His breath made small clouds. The cold was the same cold. There was a fox at the edge of the ice, very still. Rust-colored, large, amber eyes that found his face across the distance with an attention that had no anxiety in it. It was standing at the same boundary, snow to ice, paws planted on the snowy side, looking at him. He stopped, and he thought about a 9-year-old boy standing in this same place with a school bag on his back, running late, not understanding yet what being stopped can mean. He thought about the thin sound through the cold air and the orange rope coiled on its post. He thought about Mott pressing against him in the snow, both of them shaking, and a precise working understanding of vulpine territorial behavior and sensory perception. And none of that knowledge made the morning feel smaller. Everything in a silence that asked nothing and explained nothing and gave him exactly what the silence at the edge of frozen. Water has always given people who are willing to stand still long enough to receive it. And the birch trees received it the way they receive everything, without comment. He stood at the bank for a long time after it was gone. Later, he would try to write about this moment in a paper on territorial memory and environmental sensing in carnivore species. And the paper would go through 7 drafts before he admitted to himself that the thing he was trying to say about that morning was not something a paper could hold. He filed the drafts. He kept the note from Ren Solberg in its box. He went back to the lake the following January, and the January after that. He stopped trying to explain what the fox had known. He started trying to deserve the fact that it had waited for him to understand it. The ice in the morning. The birch trees holding the light. A 9-year-old boy who had learned to follow something he could not name across a bank of frozen snow toward a rope that was waiting. That was all. That was everything. You just carry them, the way the territory carries its animals.